We're incredibly fortunate. Let's hear from our Congressman Ron Estes.
Well, thank you. Thank you, David, for that kind introduction. Talk about a lot of positive things. You have to pay some people to say positive things about you. So, particularly if you're a member of the group of people in the country that have the lowest approval rating of anybody, even below used car salespeople. So, I do appreciate that introduction, David. I will say this, that the last time I was here, my wife Susan introduced me. And so most people that are here today that have talked to me asked me where Susan is, so if she was here. So I kind of joked earlier that more people asked me where Susan was than said hello to me coming in. Yeah. Which goes without saying. She's in Topeka, and today's supposed to be their wrap-up day for the first session, and so I don't know how long today's going to go for them, but I'm used to being asked where she is. In fact, most of my colleagues in D.C. Ask me where she is too when she's not been up there for the last 3 months, and they like her better than me, and most of them will tell you to your face. They'll tell me to my face too, both colleagues and their spouses. So it's good to be here. I'm just honored to be the representative of the 4th District and be able to help represent Kansas and do some of the things and continue to fight for some of the things that are our Kansas values in Washington. And it's the whole role of what the House of Representatives is supposed to be, is to be the representative of folks across the country. And obviously what we value in Kansas should be some of those values that other states value as well, and people aren't. I mean, there's been such a change over the last 2 centuries in terms of what people's thought process are. So it's a continued effort that we have to push for. One of the things I look at and kind of, I'm going to talk a little bit about this legislative session, some of the things going on in D.C., and then of course allow some time for questions at the end. But I am serving again this year on the Ways and Means Committee, and I've moved up to, or added onto my list of subcommittees. I'm on the Trade Subcommittee, which deals with all trade issues that go through the House of Representatives. Obviously, that's a great issue for Kansas when we deal with aviation issues, when we deal with agriculture issues, and just when we talk about free and fair markets and how great the effort is that we want to move forward. And the second subcommittee I'm on is the Tax Subcommittee. So all tax issues that run through the House of Representatives come through our committee. And so we're going to be busy this year as President Biden brings forth his great tax increase, or at least his great tax increase this year. I'm sure there'll be another one next year that they'll bring out. But those are the types of issues that we deal with in the Tax Committee. And then the third subcommittee I'm on is Social Security. And obviously that's an area where we have to address it. It's a program that you kind of set on automatic pilot, and if you don't pay attention to it, it runs off course, and that's kind of the direction we're headed. And we need to make sure we come back and preserve and protect Social Security. We've got a good template from the 1980s with the Greenspan Commission in terms of what they did to help expand it through the baby boomer cycle of increase of people while they're working, and now they're moving into retirement age. And we need to come back and do that same thing for the millennial generation to make sure that the program's around to help them moving forward. I just want to talk. I'm going to start off just talking about several pieces of legislation that have come through the session and what's being talked about. And I want to start with the so-called COVID relief bill that was passed 4 weeks ago now. And it's a pure example of don't let a crisis go to waste. even though it had this lofty sounding title of being for COVID relief, less than 9% of the bill dealt with COVID healthcare issues. You know, the things about buying vaccines, making sure we paid for the distribution, making sure that healthcare issues were addressed through that. So it was a $1.9 trillion bill, and literally less than one dime out of every dollar moved forward on that. The problem that we have is that, or one of the problems we have, is that the mainstream reader doesn't want to highlight that. So they're willing to promote that title of being a COVID relief bill, and you know, instead it ended up having so much of the boondoggle spending in there, bailouts for particularly Democrat states that had been mismanaged over the years. And you know, they even went back and, you know, we passed 5 pieces of legislation in 2020 that dealt with COVID relief. And even though I choked and held my nose spending some of that money, those were probably the right decisions at that point in time, particularly back in March when we didn't know what was all going to happen with COVID issues, and looking at setting up the Paycheck Protection Program and setting up funding for state and local governments to help make sure that the personal protective equipment was available, and starting Operation Warp Speed, which was so vital to getting past the pandemic. But all 5 of those bills passed last year were done on a bipartisan basis, and this bill this year was rammed through, even though President Biden in his inauguration speech talked about unity and unity and unity over and over again. Coming out of that, then he said, well, if the Republicans aren't going to work with us, then we'll just go it alone and ram through this big bill and ram through the bailout. They even threw out the formula that had been used with the CARES bill, that third and the largest of the bills that we passed last year, that actually funded money based on a percentage of population, and they weighted it more towards the states that had higher unemployment, which basically was driven by the governors, in most cases Democrat governors, had shut the states down so that they had higher unemployment, which then meant they got a bigger share of the bailout in that process. So I could go on and on about so many of the bad provisions of that bill. I mean, they brought back in the higher federal unemployment funding and added it to the state unemployment funding. So none of the state plans are short of money. I mean, they're all spending down their unemployment pools, but on top of that was added all of the federal money. And as of right now, based on what was passed in that so-called COVID relief bill, 1/3 of the people in the country who are unemployed get paid more to stay unemployed than they were getting paid on their job. So that's 1/3 of the people in the country, which obviously has an impact more on a state like Kansas and some of the states that have a more reasonable cost of living. And so basically what that's done is slowed down the economic growth. Even though people are getting back to work, last month there were 900,000 new jobs added, people going back to work. Granted, there's still a lot of people that are unemployed, particularly as the restaurants are closed and some of the entertainment venues and movie theaters and things that are either closed or very limited capacity to operate. But the jobs were coming back, and that's the key in terms of getting the economy going, is getting people back to work. It's not giving them additional bailout from the federal government. I used to make the comment that our kids and grandkids are going to have to pay off the federal debt, and now it's at the point where our grandkids and great grandkids are going to have to pay it off. We've added with this $1.9 trillion added on top of the $4.5 trillion that was passed in 2020. We're up to $6 trillion in terms of just added debt that's been on top of the deficit that was already there. I mean, normally we've been building up to roughly $1 trillion deficit just on normal spending. And so now what we've done is taken our debt up to $28 trillion, where in terms of looking at where the country is, it's a big impact for economic growth, and how do we move that forward? One of the things I didn't mention earlier, because it seems more appropriate in talking about the economy, is I've also been appointed to the Joint Economic Committee, which is a 11-member panel made up of senators and representatives, Republicans and Democrats, that actually focuses on, it's really supposed to be the legislative branch's version of the National Council of Economic Advisors. And it really hasn't been doing much in the last few years in terms of being the thought leader and the discussion point and the source of economic information. So much of what we do, we rely on the Congressional Budget Office, because they are the ones that actually go out and score bills and put the cost impact on spending for that. But being on the JEC, the Joint Economic Committee, one of the things I want to do more of is let's talk about what's going on with the economy. What are the impacts of some of these decisions, the things that we're doing, the things that are good policy and bad policy as we move forward, and what do we do to help make our economy grow, to help get more people back to work, and be able to have more money in their pockets so that they can care for their families. And that's what we were doing so great before COVID hit. Between the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that we passed, the regulatory reform and restrictions that had been brought through with President Trump and his administration, the economy was doing was in some criteria the best economy we'd ever had in the country. I mean, we had more job openings than we had people looking for work, which is unheard of in terms of how you keep the economy going, because there's always people looking for work, looking for that new job, and we were just going so great in January and February before COVID shut everything down. And unfortunately, I'm fearful that President Biden's going to follow the same playbook that President Obama did and go back to a very mundane economy, ho-hum economy in terms of what happens and how we grow, and we won't see that positive economic growth. And the best example I can talk about is what's being brought up now as the so-called infrastructure project and bill that they're trying to introduce and move forward. We all need infrastructure. I mean, we have an ongoing, what used to be called the highway bill, and then in the last few reauthorization cycles, it's been called the surface transportation bill, because it's included funding for mass transit systems and trains as well. So that expires in September. It actually expired last September, and it was extended a year. So we have to come back and revisit that, and we need to do something about that. We need to do something about the Highway Trust Fund. Doesn't have enough money to build and maintain all the roads and bridges that we have in the country, and part of that's because vehicles are more fuel efficient. Part of it's because we're giving all these tax incentives for electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles that aren't paying into the gas tax. So as a result, we're not only giving away federal tax dollars through the tax credits, but then we don't have the revenues coming in on the gas tax to maintain the roads and bridges. And so when you look at this so-called infrastructure bill, the $2.25 trillion that President Biden had proposed, less than 5% of that goes to roads and bridges. And if you add up all of the traditional infrastructure things, that's less than 25% of the bill. And when I talk about traditional infrastructure things, it's roads and bridges, includes the funding for the rail system, includes mass transit funding for mass transit systems. It includes support for the airports. It includes support for the ports and waterways. All of that's less than 25%, and something that the federal government hasn't done enough of in the last few years, but is coming to realization, support for broadband and broadband access. If you lump all of those categories together, that's less than the 25%. Probably the most positive things in the bill is that there is recognition that we need to do more on broadband area. I mean, in my opinion, we need to look at it the same way that we looked at rural electrification back in the 30s and 40s, of making sure that everybody in the country had access to high-speed internet, because we've seen so many things that are positive values out of it. I mean, COVID kind of highlighted a couple of things. One, it highlighted that people need to have the access. I mean, if you're staying home to work at home, you need to have access. Your parents, if they're one or both of them are working, if your kids are having the capability to do schoolwork, even when we get back to everything normal on COVID, there's still some value in having school kids having remote access to some classes that maybe their school district didn't offer. I mean, maybe you want to have an advanced math or advanced physics class that you couldn't offer in Pratt because there's not enough. And I'm not picking on Pratt. There's not enough students that would take it, but have the electronic capability to use broadband and access that. In more rural districts, particularly in western Kansas, you might want to have foreign language access and other things that you wouldn't necessarily have access. So we need broadband to do that. We need broadband to help Main Street stores, Main Street shops, because so much work now, so much retail is done online, both in terms of finding where you want to go, whether you want to go to eat out, whether you want to go if you want to find, buy something. A lot of successful small town Main Street shops are making their mark through the internet and being able to market worldwide. So they need to have broadband access for that. Our farmers need to have access, just from a standpoint, how do they use the technology and the equipment they have today? How do you use the best practices to make sure that you can track where the best yields are in your field, where you need to put more fertilizer, where you don't, where you need more water, where you don't, where you can actually reach out to the commodities market and make your own decisions about where you're going to sell your product. And there's so much now with global trade. In some cases, China in particular, playing games. And on any given day, in order to drive the price down in the market, they just may stop buying. So instead of buying their normal 1,000,000 bushels a day, they stop, which automatically has a chilling effect on the marketplace. It not only drops that day, but it also stays out there as a risk the next few days, because you don't know whether the marketplace doesn't know where they're going to come back in. And so, we need to have that capability. So at least there's some if there's anything positive in what's being talked about in the bill, is having a recognition of broadband and the need there. Telehealth. If there's any silver lining out of COVID, well, there may be two silver linings. One's the recognition about telehealth and how important that is across the country. Actually, this morning I was at the VA, and Secretary Donald was here. He was actually meeting with the VA. He's going around the state, and Senator Rand's going around the state with him. So talking about what's going on in best practices, and the VA utilized that a lot in terms of having the ability to reach out to the veterans. But it's so important for everybody, and so that's one of the silver linings out of COVID, is that a lot of my colleagues who live in major urban cities didn't recognize how important telehealth was until COVID hit. And as much as we've been talking about it, it just wasn't on their radar screen. They didn't even think about it. And then the second thing, I think, you talk about silver lining, is just the ability that when we focus the government on a project like Operation Warp Speed, that we came back and were able to develop the vaccines and make sure that we could actually utilize the successful processes, overlap them, in some cases concurrently, making sure that we were successful in building that vaccine and being able to roll that out. So what I'm hopeful for, instead of passing this $2.25 trillion boondoggle that has not just 25% of it that goes to infrastructure, but a piece of it that goes off to funding additional social welfare programs and more housing and senior living centers and funding and additional Green New Deal provisions that put in place and mandate all of these changes, that we can get back, pare that down to let's pass and make sure we get a legitimate infrastructure bill that addresses the surface transportation needs and move forward, and some of that other stuff get thrown out in the process. And a lot of it's going to depend on Senator Joe Manchin, and I kind of jokingly call him the most important man in America. As long as, one, he stands up and says that he's not going to support getting rid of the filibuster. But then, excuse me. It's bad to get choked up talking about a Democrat senator, right? One, in terms of not doing away with the filibuster, which would change policy provisions, and things like the $15 an hour mandated federal minimum wage. Without the ability to have a filibuster to stop policy like that. What can be done in reconciliation is raise taxes and raise spending that's tied to that budget. As long as there's reasonable spending plans, and hopefully, in addition to opposing the filibuster, Senator Manchin will keep an eye on unreasonable spending that might come down the pike as well. I'm going to quit saying his name now. Anyway, that's what's what to look for this summer. Obviously it's been introduced now, and when we go back next week, that'll be the start of discussions, and committees will start talking through that. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about what's a self-inflicted wound to the country that President Biden did with the border. And what he's basically done is tell the world that the United States policies to not to have any border security, that he undoes and undid all of the policies that President Trump had put in place. And I'll back up a little bit in terms of saying we need to do some major work with our whole immigration process. We're a country of immigrants. We still have the largest number of people that immigrate into the United States legally every year, much more than any other country in the world. And we should continue to do that. It continues to help us grow and become a stronger country. But we have so many things that are, one, broken if you're actually trying to go through the legal process. We have steps that are broken if you come here on a student visa and want to go to work. After that, the difficulty in doing that, we're basically educating all of these young men and women and sending them back to their home country to compete against us when they want to be here. And so we've got to fix that, and we also got to fix the people that are here illegally. Whether you came across the border illegally or whether you overstayed a legitimate visa that you had, which depends on the year. There's, in a lot of cases, more people that overstay visas. So we've got to address that too. But what President Biden and the Biden administration has done basically is just tell people, come into the border, come into the country. And part of the problem with our existing law is that it's so I'm not sure the right word. I was going to use the word schizophrenic, but that may not be adequate enough in terms of talking about it. If you are a Mexican citizen and you walk across the border illegally and you get caught, our laws say we send you back to Mexico. But if you're a Guatemalan and walk across the southern border into the United States, the laws say we don't send you back. You have to go through a process to be sent back to your, and in the meantime, you get to stay in the United States. And so what one of the things President Trump had done that was so successful was work with Mexico to say, because of the way the U.S. laws work, Mexico, why don't you help hold those folks that you've let come from Guatemala, from Honduras, from El Salvador, up through Mexico, hold those on the Mexican side, we'll process them, but instead of them coming into our Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, that are then being shipped out to the rest of the country, let's hold them on Mexico. We'll go through the adjudication process, and if for some reason there is a legitimate asylum claim, then we can proceed with that. The problem on the asylum process is right now the way the law says is if anybody comes, any of these people who get into the country and claim asylum, then they get a hearing to adjudicate whether that's true or not. Problem is, it's 2 and 3 years into the future for the hearing. So they're released into the country, and in most cases they were released, I have a cousin in Cleveland or something, so they get sent up there so that they can stay there. Of course, they don't have legal status, so if they do find a job, it's got to be an under-the-table job, so you run the risk of an employer maybe abusing them in that scenario, paying them under the table, which affects taxes. It also run the risk that how are they going to support themselves while they're here with other concerns. Of those people that when their hearing comes in 2 to 3 years, the numbers vary, but roughly 60% of them don't ever show up for the hearing. So now they're in the country legally. So now of the 40% that do show up in the country, roughly 10% of those have a legitimate asylum claim, as opposed to, I just want to make more money, so I'm coming to the United States to make more money than I would make in my home country. So of those, that 40%, so now we're down to roughly 4% of the people that have come across the border have a legitimate asylum claim. But of those 40% that their claim gets denied that after they show up at the hearing, then they're ordered deported, but most of them don't show up on the day they're supposed to be deported. So at the end of the day, everybody that's come into the country that doesn't have a claim, everybody that's coming into the country basically stays in the country. And that's just one of the areas that is broken. And we had a good bill in 2018. It wasn't perfect. It addressed there's been a lot of talk about DACA and the kids that came with their parents, or the kids that were born here where the parents came illegally. Our intention in that bill was to, give people, don't give them amnesty, but give them the opportunity to apply for citizenship, let them go through the process, let them get in line, and it reduced it eliminated the extended chain migration. So if somebody does get to citizenship, the way our law is today, once somebody gets citizenship, they can bring in all of their family. And, conceptually, if you think about it, you think, well, that's my spouse and my minor kids. Well, that's not what the law says. The law says, yeah, you can bring in your spouse and your minor kids. You can also bring in your adult kids. You can also bring in your brothers, your sisters, your parents, your spouse's parents. And so what the law the Goodlatte bill would have done, would have said, no, we're going back to core family, which is what the intention was. The citizen the new citizen, their spouse, their minor kids, and if the other adults in their family wanted to make citizenship, they could come in on their own volition. And unfortunately, it's a political football, and it's going to be a lot of problems. We're seeing now where all the things that the media was hyping about how bad things were under President Trump on the border, it's much worse now with President Biden and what they're doing, and particularly when the numbers they tripled from February of 2020 to February of 2021 in terms of the illegals that were apprehended, and they're doubled from January to February of this year. So it's an ongoing thing. I will talk. I want to talk a few positive things in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, and then open it up for questions. I did badmouth the so-called COVID relief bill earlier. Like I said, it had very little for actual health relief, but we were able to work together. I had introduced a bill with a Democrat House member from Washington State, Rick Larson, who's the chair of the Aviation Subcommittee, and working with Senator Moran and Senator Warner on the Senate side, I had introduced a companion bill that we were calling the Aviation Manufacturing Jobs Protection Act. And so we'd introduced standalone bills last year. Luckily, we were able to get it included in the $1.9 trillion bill that just passed. And basically what that does is it in lieu of layoffs for aviation companies that can attest to the Department of Transportation that they're at risk of laying off 25% or more of their workforce, that they can apply to the federal government. The federal government will fund half of the payroll costs for their employees, provided they keep them on staff. So the company has to pay the other half the payroll cost, has to pay all the other operating costs, keeps their employees in the workforce. It minimizes the impact on unemployment from that standpoint. So it's a great way. One of the really positive things for us is it keeps skilled workforce here instead of becoming unemployed and getting stolen away. One of the things we always have a big problem with is we have such a strong commercial aviation and general aviation manufacturing that goes through the peaks and valleys of the economy, whereas other parts of the country have a lot stronger defense manufacturing, which is pretty steady. So a lot of these defense companies were coming into Wichita to hire away our workforce. It started when the 737 MAX issue hit, but it was continuing on, and luckily COVID slowed it down a little bit. But that was one of the values of the Aviation Manufacturing Jobs Protection Act, was it keeps our skilled workforce here, keeps them connected to the employer, and it minimizes the impact on unemployment because of having a program like that. So that was one good thing. The sad part is I've had to vote against the bill, so I voted against it. And Rick Larson, when I saw him walking back and forth in the hallway before the vote, he said, "I know you're going to vote against the bill, but you're welcome because the provisions are in there." So he was nice about it in terms of us working through that. We're continuing to focus on, as we talk about, how can we bring more jobs back into the United States? And one of the bills that I'm promoting is let's amortize research and development, R&D cost, and make sure those are deductible. Because as so many companies are looking at getting their production out of China, particularly when we've seen all the issues with 85% of our pharmaceuticals come from China, and so much of the personal protective equipment, and so many other things. But looking at, okay, let's get the research and development back in the United States so that the manufacturing jobs can actually come back here as well. So that's one of the things that we're pushing, trying to push on how do we protect water rights for the federal government, and I think this is going to ramp back up. The Obama administration was really bad on it. with WOTUS, the Waters of the U.S., and luckily during the Trump administration we were able to beat back some of the bad provisions. But I think the Biden administration is going to be pretty bad as well on some of those things. We talk about there's been a lot of discussion about police reform, and the Democrat version of that is just mandate that police lose all the rights, that they unlimited liability, and that all this information become public record, including their home address and all of that information. And we actually have introduced a bill called the Justice Act, which actually provides for some reform. It provides some additional funding so that all law enforcement can have body cameras, so that you can actually see what the events transpire and get the whole story of what goes on. The bill actually was led by Representative Pete Stauber from Minnesota. He was a police officer. Actually, he worked with Gordon Ramsay before Gordon Ramsay came down here to be the police chief in Wichita. So it's kind of interesting to have that connection with Pete and Gordon there. So there's one of the big pushes we're putting on now is, how do we come back and focus on getting one of the things that somehow nobody knows how, but got snuck into the $1.9 trillion COVID bill, was for the states that get these bailouts, the states couldn't lower their taxes. Otherwise, they'd have to give back the bailout money. So for states that wanted to be fiscally prudent and say, we don't want to just throw money away and spend it willy-nilly, lowering taxes on that there's wording in there that wouldn't allow that. So we're pushing pretty hard to get clarification that states can continue that process of managing their own taxes. I know several attorney generals, including Derek Schmidt, is on a lawsuit that saying the federal government shouldn't dictate tax policy at each state. And so that's probably one of the big things we're moving forward. So I know I've talked about several different things going on. I wanted to allow some time for questions, but I don't know how you want to do that, whether you want to just jump into questions or.
Okay, the rules for Pachyderm Club, keep your questions nice, kind. We're always thankful for our speakers, especially Ron Estes. Pachyderm members get to go first, and we'll try to get everybody.
First of all, Congressman, I want to thank you for voting against adding earmarks to the budget. But it was sadly to hear that the majority of Republicans in the House voted to have earmarks. So, what is your take on earmarks? It's like you vote for my bill and I'll vote for your bill. This, to me, is corruption. What is your take on those earmarks?
So the earmarks really came out in a bad way up until 2010. When the Republican majority came over and took the House. And at that point in time, that's when earmarks were banned in the rules. The Senate have different sets of rules. They still, a senator can still come before a committee and bring particular things up. What's actually been brought up, the bigger problem is not earmarks or directed spending. The biggest problem is we're spending too much money. I mean, that's the piece that we need to go focus. Just because the federal government can spend money, which doesn't necessarily mean we should. And that's where we get into. There are things we should spend money on. And in my opinion, it should be limited. It should be, we should have a small government. It should be focused on the things that the federal government is supposed to do. What we saw back before 2010, the pendulum swung too far in terms of literally in some cases, to get you to vote for a bill, I'm going to include your request to go fund money for Lawrence Welk's birthplace home and give you the $1 million to go start a museum there. And literally that was one of the projects. I don't know that it was $1 million, but it was $500,000 or $750,000, something like that. Now the pendulum swung too far the other way. And so now what we do is we pass a multi-billion-dollar bill, multi-trillion-dollar bill, and have billions of dollars worth of grant money in it, and the cabinet secretaries dictate where that money goes. And I have to go lobby the cabinet secretary to say, spend the money on this project in my district. I mean, in fact, I did that with the North Junction funding earlier this last year, in terms of saying, this is a good project, it's important for the region, it's important for the state, and instead of throwing the money away somewhere else. So what I think we need to get to the point is, one, let's reduce the pot of money we're allocating, period, that we go forward. Let's make sure that we do focus that spending on specific projects that are important and that are of value. It's going to be interesting as we move forward this year. There's actually two sets of discussions around it. One is I won't say reintroducing earmarks, but it's close. Excuse me, it's close to reintroducing earmarks. And then the other piece that we're trying to focus on is let's look at some things in the transportation bill that are specific projects. They're not giveaways to charitable organizations, they're not giveaways to businesses, but they're specific, focused on specific projects. Do it in an open and transparent way so people see what we're doing, and then how do we make sure that what gets important for the highest priorities for Kansas and for the 4th District happen. And so it's going to be interesting to see how this year goes. With the Senate parliamentarians' rule of that the Democrats can run more than one reconciliation bill, we're thinking that they may not even do appropriations. They may just run reconciliation after reconciliation, and that way they don't have to go through the committee process. They just dump it into a bill that goes for reconciliation. So this year's going to be a year of transition, and we're going to have to continue to fight tooth and nail on spending.
Yeah, Congressman Ron. A Barron's article about 9 months ago talked about the fact that the Chinese owned companies, or the 50%, 51% of Chinese owned companies, do not report the same financial data in the same way. They are given certain exclusions by the SEC. So when we look at the stock, we need to look at our 10Ks and 10Qs on the same basis. Did you look into that?
Yep. Nope. You're spot on in terms of that. We, over the last 25, 30 years, the United States, Europe, we've treated China with kid gloves. And you know, my personal opinion is going forward, China's going to be the biggest threat to world peace, world stability, and maintaining that. They participate in these world organizations, but they make sure that the rules are structured so that it benefits China. For example, they made sure their person was the head of the World Health Organization. And lo and behold, that person declared that, you know, there wasn't any problems with COVID coming in, you know, that they did a good job containing it in our country. One of the things that U.S. and European countries in particular, companies did in particular, was they got so excited about such a big marketplace in China with the number of citizens that they have there, that they basically, in a lot of ways, gave away the farm. They were willing to give away intellectual property. They were willing to give away ownership of ventures, joint ventures to have there. And in some intellectual property that wasn't given away was stolen in some cases. And Chinese companies were, in order to be listed on a New York Stock Exchange, were given the benefit of not having to follow the same standards of auditing and reporting and tracking ownership and liability. And that's wrong. I mean, we shouldn't do that. I mean, if China wants to be a country where the Communist Party owns a lot of their production, That's a choice they can make. I think it's a wrong choice. I think it's not going to pan out. But they shouldn't be allowed the benefits of being in a free and fair trade and open society through that. So we've got a lot of things to unwind through that process. And in the meantime, we're starting behind because they've been headed in. They've got a lot of momentum, and we've got to blunt that.
The next question over here.
Thank you for being here, Ron. There was always debate about upping the debt limit, but we never hear about that at all. And then would you talk a little about HR 1? I used to think that every bill that passed the legislature, they had to see if it was constitutional or not. I don't think HR 1 is truly constitutional.
So the debt limit, the Democrats in the House did something pretty insidious in the rules this year. So we used to, have to do 2 votes. We voted to appropriate money every year, and then we also voted to say this was our debt limit. This is what the United States government could borrow. And so what the Democrats did in the House rules this year is word it so that if you pass a spending bill, then it automatically qualifies that you've passed the debt, you've increased the debt ceiling by the equal amount. So it's just kind of snuck it in with the expectation now that there won't be any more debt ceiling votes in the next 2 years because of that. That's why it's so important that we take back the majority in the House, and we're in great shape to do that. The last year we gained 13 seats. The Republicans gained 13 seats in the House of Representatives. Which counterbalance to what happened on the Senate in terms of losing a few seats, the Democrats winning the presidency. I'll put winning in quotes. It depends on how you want to describe that. But what the American people at the grassroots said is we don't want this big government process. And so now with redistricting, there's so many seats that are moving from Democrat states to Republican states. I mean, Texas is going to pick up 3 seats. Florida is going to pick up 2, and so it's that alone will be 6 seats that are switched, and we're only down 5 right now. And that's if it's not done in a political fashion. The expectations are redistricting probably is going to bring 9 or 10 if you Republican-controlled legislators and governors work through that. Plus just the history's on our side in that the first midterm election for a president since World War II has lost an average of 27 seats. So I'm very confident we're going to take majority back in the House next session. The Senate, I think it's a tougher map because there's not as many at-risk Democrats as there are in the Senate side, so it's going to be tougher. HR 1 question there. Typically, the House reserves HR 1 as the number for its most important bill, the bill that it thinks is most important. In Pelosi's version, HR 1 is the For the Politicians Act. They call it For the People Act, but it's really for the politicians. Basically what the bill does is it changes all the election rules. A federal takeover of elections instead of the states doing it the way they've been doing it. The mandating that from here forward, all states have to send out ballots to anybody that's on the voting rolls, regardless of whether they request it or not, which is part of the problem we saw this past cycle was that ballots being mailed to folks that didn't request them and mailed out of state. So people moved either in state or moved out of state even. They still got a ballot. And so that was, some of those questions that came up through the election. The actual Constitution spells out the presidential elector process a little bit more clearly. I mean, it clearly says the state legislators select who the electors are. It doesn't as clearly spell out other elections. And so that's a piece that some of that's left to setting in statute what to do. So I'm hopeful that Manchin will maintain his statement that he's not going to do away with the filibuster and that now I'm going to have to get a drink of water, right? That won't, that's a policy change that wouldn't make it through the Senate. without a filibuster.
Last question here.
Thanks for being here, Congressman, appreciate it. Talk a little bit more about the 737 MAX, and tell us a little bit more about what's going on with that, what you know.
So, I mean, obviously there were some design issues, you know, that we've gone through and worked through. The FAA probably took a little bit longer than I thought they needed to. I think they checked everything out in the plane, every bolt and design and everything. I think it's the safest plane you could fly on. I actually had the opportunity to fly on one of the earlier promotional flights back right at the start of this year. I don't have enough details at my fingertips, but I saw this morning that there was a question about the electrical wiring in some of the planes that were made that were built from scratch through the process. And so I need to get some more information on that. So that basically what Boeing has asked the airlines that are using those is that the planes that they've received that were through the manufacturing process, they think they've discovered some problem in that or potential problem in that they want to go back and revisit that. And I don't know what that was, whether it could be something as simple as they just didn't have enough insulation or they didn't have enough the leads connected in a wiring harness of some sort. I don't know enough about the issue yet. The overall rollout for 737s now is, of course they had over 400 finished planes in Washington, had over 100 cockpits and fuselages out at Spirit here. So their plan was, and as far as I know still is to work some of those in while they're starting the manufacturing process and ramping that back up. My understanding was that they're going to manufacture more than they use of the already completed sub-assemblies, so that actually they can get, which is a better thing for us here, because we have so many manufacturers in the supply chain that they had sub-assemblies, they had raw materials, they had staffing to make at a 52 to 59 plane rate, and obviously that's just cratered. And so the more we can get back to manufacturing, the better it is for all of us here to go through that process and get that moving forward. But I need to get some more information on what this latest announcement was this morning from Boeing on the wiring issue. So I just want to thank y'all for the opportunity to come speak, and I apologize I couldn't bring Susan, but she's my state rep, and I want her there doing her work, right? That doesn't go over very well when I tell her that I pay your taxes and I want but it's great to be here. It's always great to see friends and a good opportunity to kind of talk about some of the things. And there's just such a variety of things that we've got going on and will continue to go on. And so thank you again for the opportunity.
Congressman Ron Estes, great presentation.